please share and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. I remember the night she disappeared. The princess, just 16, terrified, clinging to the doorframe as the men dragged her out. She screamed for her father, her voice breaking into the quiet darkness of the palace. But the king never came. He never even knew. By the time he woke up, she was gone, and nothing in our kingdom would ever be the same again. The night the princess disappeared, the air was thick with the scent of rain that never came. The torches along the palace walls flickered weakly, their glow barely reaching the edges of the grand courtyard. I was just a servant, no one of importance, but even I could feel something was wrong. The silence was unnatural, too heavy, as if the very walls were holding their breath. I had been making my way back to the servants' quarters when I saw them. Dark figures slipping past the guards, their movements too smooth, too practiced. A shiver ran down my spine. My instinct was to run, to hide, but my feet refused to move. Then I heard it, the soft creak of a door opening, the rustle of fabric, and a muffled cry. At first, the sound was barely noticeable, like a whisper swallowed by the night. But then it grew low, desperate, filled with panic. It came from the eastern wing, where only one person resided, Princess Eleanor. My stomach twisted. I had served in the palace long enough to know that no one entered the princess's chambers unannounced, not even her personal guards. I pressed myself against the stone wall, my heart hammering. The door to her room was wide open now, the golden embroidery on the curtains shimmering in the weak torchlight. Inside, shadowy figures moved swiftly. I saw Eleanor's small frame, her long nightdress pooling around her feet as she struggled against them. They covered her mouth before she could scream, but her eyes, wild and terrified, met mine for a brief second. I wanted to help, to do something, but I knew I was no match for them. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I watched helplessly. The men dragged her toward the back exit, where the palace wall met the dense forest. She fought, her bare feet scraping against the stone floor, her hands clawing at their arms. But they were too strong. I watched, frozen in place, as they lifted her onto a waiting horse. The last thing I saw before they disappeared into the darkness was her hand reaching out, fingers trembling, before she was swallowed by the night. The palace remained silent, unaware. The guards lay motionless, their bodies slumped against the walls, and I stood there, trapped in my own fear, knowing that by the time the sun rose, it would be too late. Morning came slowly, the first rays of light creeping through the palace like hesitant fingers. The golden walls, once shimmering with warmth, now felt cold and lifeless. I watched from the shadows as the palace began to stir, the usual morning routines unfolding, servants sweeping the corridors, cooks preparing breakfast, guards changing shifts. No one knew. Not yet. But dread sat heavy in my stomach. Every second that passed was another second lost. Then the first scream shattered the quiet. It came from one of the maids who had gone to wake the princess. The sound echoed down the halls, raw and filled with panic. The palace guards rushed toward the eastern wing, their heavy boots pounding against the marble floor. More voices joined in, gasps, shouts, confusion. And then silence. A thick, suffocating silence as the truth settled over us all like a suffocating fog. The king's chambers were at the heart of the palace, a place no one dared disturb unless summoned. But that morning, the doors were flung open without hesitation. The guards hesitated only a moment before stepping inside, their armor clanking softly in the dimly lit room. The king lay still in his bed, his broad frame barely moving beneath the silk sheets. When his advisor, Lord Samuel, spoke his name, there was no immediate response. It was only when a second, more urgent call was made that the king's eyes finally opened. For a brief moment, he looked at them in confusion, his mind still caught between sleep and wakefulness. but as he registered their grim expressions, his face darkened. Lord Samuel did not sugarcoat his words. He did not soften the blow. "Your Majesty, the princess is gone." The weight of those words was unbearable even to hear, but to the king they were a death sentence. At first, he did not move. He simply stared, as if his mind refused to accept it. Then, something shifted. He threw the sheets aside, his movements slow, deliberate. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Where is she?" No one could answer. The palace guards had failed. His daughter had been taken from under his very nose. His body swayed slightly, his hands gripping the bedpost for support. Then, as if struck by an invisible force, he sank to his knees. The mighty King Edmund, ruler of this land, bowed by grief. The servants in the room turned their faces away, unable to bear the sight. No one dared to touch him. No one knew what to say. Minutes passed, stretching into eternity. And then, slowly, he raised his head. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, were hollow, empty. Something inside him had broken, something no one could fix. And as I watched from the doorway, unseen and forgotten, a terrible thought settled in my mind. The king would never be the same again. The palace had never been so quiet. The usual sounds of mourning, the soft chatter of servants, the rhythmic clatter of dishes from the kitchens, the measured footsteps of guards patrolling the halls, had all vanished. It was as if the walls themselves mourned. Grief clung to every corner, heavy and suffocating. The king had not left his chambers since the news broke. Food was brought to him, but it remained untouched. His closest advisors tried to speak with him, but he barely acknowledged their presence. He sat by the window for hours, staring at the horizon as if expecting his daughter to ride home at any moment. But she didn't, and deep down, I think he knew she never would. Outside the palace walls, rumors were already spreading like wildfire. At first, people whispered of bandits, of rogue mercenaries hired by an unknown enemy. But then a new name emerged, one spoken in hushed voices, as if saying it too loudly would invite a curse. Lord Victor, the king's own brother. It was the guards who first brought it up. They spoke of how the attack had been too precise, too clean. There had been no signs of a struggle outside the princess's chambers, no alarms raised until morning. Whoever had taken her had moved with knowledge of the palace's every weakness, and who, besides those closest to the king, would have access to such information? The realization was chilling. It was no secret that Lord Victor had long envied his brother. There had always been whispers of resentment, of ambitions left unfulfilled, but no one had believed he would go this far. No one had thought him capable of something so monstrous. The advisors met in secret, their voices low and urgent as they debated what to do. Some insisted they confront the king, force him to act before it was too late. Others feared that accusing Victor without proof would only weaken the kingdom further. As they argued, I lingered in the shadows, unnoticed. And then, for the first time in days, the king spoke. His voice, though quiet, carried through the chamber like a cold wind. "He has already won," he said, his eyes still locked on the distant hills beyond the window. The room fell into stunned silence. No one dared to contradict him. No one knew how. Because in that moment, we all saw the truth. Lord Victor hadn't just taken the princess. He had taken something far worse. He had stolen the king's will to fight. Days passed, but the weight of the princess's absence only grew heavier. The once thriving palace had become a place of mourning, its grand halls now filled with whispers and uncertainty. The king remained locked away, neither speaking nor ruling, leaving the kingdom to drift like a ship without a captain. Servants moved carefully, their footsteps lighter than before, as if afraid that making too much noise would shatter what little remained of their fragile world. The guards, once proud and vigilant, now stood with slumped shoulders, their confidence shaken. But amidst the grief, amidst the despair, there were those who still searched for answers, and I was one of them. One night, as the candles flickered low and the castle's corridors lay draped in shadow, I overheard something that made my blood run cold. Two guards speaking in hushed voices by the eastern tower, their faces drawn with worry. "The fortress in the north," one murmured. "That's where she is." The northern fortress was a place I had only heard about in passing, an old, abandoned stronghold that once belonged to Lord Victor before he was stripped of his lands. It had long been considered nothing more than a ruin, left to rot in the dense wilderness beyond the mountains. But if the guards were right, if the princess was truly being held there, then this nightmare was far from over. And worse, it meant Victor had been planning this for longer than any of us had realized. The weight of this knowledge settled heavily on my chest. I wanted to run to the king, to tell someone, anyone, what I had heard, but doubt gnawed at me. The king was barely a shadow of himself, his grief so deep that I wasn't sure if he would even listen. And the guards? If they knew, why had they done nothing? Fear had taken hold of this palace, paralyzing even the strongest among us. I could feel it in every breath, in every glance exchanged in the dim corridors. And so I kept my silence, knowing that the truth, no matter how terrifying, was now mine to bear alone. The fortress was nothing like the palace she had grown up in. The walls were damp, the air thick with the scent of mold and decay. Stone corridors stretched into darkness, their silence broken only by the distant dripping of water from the cracks above. Princess Eleanor sat on the cold floor, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Her dress, once soft and elegant, was now torn and stained. The first few nights had been the worst, when the reality of her captivity had truly sunk in. She had screamed until her throat was raw, pounded against the heavy wooden door, until her hands bled. No one had come. No one had answered. She had been left alone in the suffocating dark, swallowed by silence. Then, on the third night, the door creaked open. The dim light from the corridor stretched into her cell, and a figure stepped inside. Lord Victor. His presence was suffocating, his towering frame blocking what little light she had. He took slow, deliberate steps toward her, his boots clicking against the stone. "Did you think he would come for you?" he asked, his voice calm, almost amused. Eleanor didn't answer. She refused to give him the satisfaction, but Victor only chuckled, crouching before her, his dark eyes studying her face. "Your father won't save you," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's already lost." The words stung, but she clenched her jaw, forcing herself not to show fear. Victor tilted his head, waiting for a response. When none came, he sighed, rising to his feet. "You'll learn," he said, turning toward the door. "In time, you'll understand that no one is coming." The door slammed shut behind him, and the room was swallowed by darkness once more. She didn't know how many days had passed since then. Time was meaningless in the endless night of her prison. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, and exhaustion pulled at her limbs, but she refused to give in. She refused to believe that this was how her story would end. Every time Victor visited, he tried to break her, offering food in exchange for obedience, whispering poison into her ear about her father's weakness. But she held on, gripping tightly to the one thing he could never take from her, hope. No matter how much he wanted her to believe otherwise, she knew the truth. Her father was still out there, and as long as she was still breathing, she would not let him lose. The palace was no longer just a place of sorrow. It had become a place of fear. Shadows stretched longer than they should, whispers curled through corridors like unseen ghosts, and an eerie stillness settled over the kingdom. It was as if something unnatural had taken root in the very air, growing stronger with each passing day. The servants moved with wary steps, avoiding eye contact, speaking only in hushed tones. Even the guards, once firm and disciplined, now stood with uncertain hands, gripping their weapons. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, though no one dared to name it aloud. It wasn't just grief that hung over the palace. It was something else, something worse. The river that once flowed strong through the kingdom had begun to shrink, its waters receding as if pulling away from the land itself. Crops withered before they could bear fruit, and livestock grew weak without explanation. The people, already unsettled by their king's silence, now murmured of something darker at play. Some claimed it was the work of vengeful spirits, angry at the royal family for failing to protect their own. Others believed the land itself was rejecting its ruler, punishing him for his weakness. And then there were those who whispered the most chilling theory of all, that Lord Victor had done more than just take the princess, that he had cursed the kingdom, sealing it in despair until the king himself was no more. The king did not speak of these things. He did not acknowledge the dying land, nor did he react to the rumors slithering through his halls. He sat in his chamber, staring out at the fields beyond the palace walls, his face unreadable. He had not issued commands in days, had not held court, or met with his advisors. And though no one said it aloud, they all feared the same thing. The kingdom was slipping away, crumbling under a weight too great to bear. And the man who had once ruled it with strength and certainty was no longer strong, no longer certain, only fading, like the river, like the crops, like the last bit of light before the night swallowed them all. The fortress was always silent at night, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears and made even the smallest movements feel deafening. Eleanor had learned to listen beyond it, to notice the faint creak of shifting stone, the distant howls of wolves that roamed the forests beyond the walls. She had no idea how long she had been here, weeks, maybe months, but she knew one thing with certainty. Victor was right about many things, but he was wrong about her father. She would not sit in this cell forever, waiting for rescue that might never come. If no one was coming, then she would find her own way out. She had been watching, memorizing every detail of the guards' movements, the way they rotated shifts, the times they grew tired and careless. It was during one of those moments, when the moon was hidden behind thick clouds and the fortress seemed to sleep, that she acted. The scraps of cloth from her torn dress had been knotted together tightly, forming a small strip of fabric. She pressed it into the crack of the high window, tying it around the fragile leg of a small bird that sometimes nested on the ledge. It wasn't much, just a single piece of cloth bearing the royal embroidery, a silent plea for anyone who might find it. The bird hesitated only a moment before it took off, disappearing into the night. Eleanor exhaled shakily. It was a fool's hope, but it was all she had left. The next morning, Victor came to her again. His smirk was the same as always, but there was something sharper in his eyes, something that made her stomach tighten. "You look different today," he mused, stepping closer, studying her face as if searching for a crack in her resolve. She forced herself to remain still, to keep her expression blank, but her heart pounded. Had he seen? Had he noticed the missing piece of her dress? His gaze lingered a moment longer before he chuckled softly, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter," he said. "You'll learn soon enough. There's nowhere to go." As the door locked behind him, Eleanor's fingers curled into fists. He was wrong. She had already set something in motion. Now, all she could do was wait and hope that somewhere beyond these walls, someone was still listening. The bird had flown into the night, vanishing beyond the fortress walls, but Eleanor had no way of knowing if it had made it far enough. The waiting was unbearable. Each passing hour stretched endlessly, her mind filled with doubts. What if no one found it? What if the cloth was lost in the wind? Or worse, what if Victor's men intercepted it before it reached anyone who could help? She tried not to think about it, but it gnawed at her, tightening around her chest like unseen hands. Every sound outside her cell made her flinch, fearing that any moment the door would swing open and Victor would be there, holding the tattered cloth in his hands, grinning as he crushed the last shred of her hope. She had taken a risk, and all she could do now was pray that it had been worth it. Far beyond the fortress, in the heart of the kingdom, the air carried whispers of something strange. A servant boy, no older than 12, had been tending to the palace gardens when he spotted something unusual in the thorny hedges. A bird, its tiny frame trembling, struggling to free itself from the branches. He stepped closer, careful not to startle it, when he noticed something tied around its leg, a scrap of fine fabric, embroidered with a pattern he had seen before. He hesitated only a second before reaching out, loosening the threads and slipping the cloth into his palm. He recognized it instantly. His mother had once worked in the palace's sewing chambers, and she had spoken often of the royal embroidery. This was no ordinary fabric. This belonged to the princess. His heart pounded as he ran toward the palace, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste. When the king's advisors received the cloth, they examined it under the flickering candlelight, their voices low and urgent. Some believed it was a sign, proof that Eleanor was still alive. Others feared it was a trick, a cruel ploy designed to lure them into a trap. The king himself did not speak at first. He merely ran his fingers over the delicate threads, his expression unreadable. Then, for the first time in what felt like forever, something in his eyes changed. The dull emptiness that had settled there for so long flickered, just for a moment, with something else, something neither grief nor despair. Hope. He lifted his gaze, and in a voice that carried through the chamber like a command from the heavens, he spoke just 3 words: "Prepare the horses." The palace had been silent for too long, but now, for the first time in weeks, it stirred with urgency. Torches burned bright in the courtyard as armored men prepared their horses, their faces grim with determination. The king stood among them, no longer a grieving shadow, but a man with purpose, a ruler ready to reclaim what had been stolen from him. He had wasted enough time drowning in sorrow, enough nights sitting by his window, waiting for a miracle. Now he had something real, proof that his daughter was alive. And if she had found a way to send a message, then it meant she was waiting for him. He would not fail her again. With his sword strapped to his side, he mounted his horse, turning to the warriors who had sworn their loyalty to him. "We ride until we reach her," he said, his voice steady. "And we do not return without the princess." The gates creaked open, and beneath the cold glow of the moon, they rode into the night. The journey north was treacherous. The roads had long been abandoned, overgrown with twisting roots and thorny branches that clawed at their cloaks as they passed. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the distant cries of unseen creatures. Every shadow could be an enemy, every rustling leaf a trap. The men rode in silence, their senses sharp, their hands gripping their weapons tightly. The closer they got to the fortress, the heavier the air became, thick with something unseen but undeniable. It was as if the land itself recoiled from what lay ahead, warning them of the darkness that awaited. But they did not stop. The king led them forward, his eyes locked on the distant outline of the fortress, barely visible against the night sky. He had spent too long in the depths of despair. Now there was no room for fear, only action. As they reached the final stretch, the walls of the fortress loomed before them, tall and unyielding. The gates were shut, the guards stationed along the perimeter unsuspecting of the storm that was about to break upon them. The king pulled his horse to a halt, his men doing the same behind him. They had one chance, one moment to strike before the enemy realized what was happening. The air was thick with tension, the sound of their breathing the only thing filling the silence. Then, with a single nod from their king, they moved, like shadows in the dark, They surged forward. The battle for the princess had begun. The fortress had been built to withstand invaders, a place of strength meant to keep out the world, but no stone wall could keep the king's resolve at bay. With a deep breath, he drew his sword, his hand steady, and led his men toward the fortress gates. The first guard fell quickly, his shout echoing across the walls as the king's warriors charged forward. The gates were reinforced, but not enough to stop them. With a few powerful blows, they splintered, groaning in protest as the wooden beams gave way. A loud crash rang through the air, and the fortress was breached. The sound stirred something deep inside the king, a fire that had been smothered for too long, and with it, he pushed forward, his men following close behind. Inside the fortress, the air was thick with the smell of damp stone and the chill of abandonment. The halls were narrow, dimly lit by torches that flickered in the draft. Every corner held a shadow. Every movement seemed to echo like a drumbeat in the king's chest. He could feel the presence of his brother, feel his twisted ambition coiling somewhere in the dark recesses of the fortress. Lord Victor had prepared for this, but he could not anticipate the fury that drove the king. Every step toward the inner chambers was another step toward redemption, another step toward his daughter. The king moved faster, his warriors clearing the way, their swords clashing with the remnants of Victor's loyalists. Finally, they reached the heart of the fortress, the place where Eleanor was being held. The door to the chamber was bolted, thick with the marks of neglect, but it crumbled beneath the king's rage. He threw it open, and there she was, Eleanor, her eyes wide with both fear and hope. She was gaunt, her skin pale, but when their eyes met, a silent understanding passed between them. He had found her. She was still alive. The king crossed the room in 2 strides, pulling her into his arms without a second thought. "I'm here," he whispered hoarsely. "I'm here." But their reunion was brief. A dark figure emerged from the shadows, and there, standing with a twisted grin, was Lord Victor. The king felt his blood run cold at the sight of him, but he did not hesitate. The time for words was over. Without a word, he charged at his brother, the two clashing in a brutal fight. Victor was strong, his fury matching the king's, but his mind was clouded with the belief that he had already won. The battle raged, swords clanging, and the sound of their struggle reverberated through the chamber. Eleanor watched in silence, her body trembling, knowing that the outcome of this fight would determine everything. The king's strength and determination were matched by the dark, consuming rage that Victor held for his brother, and it was in that moment that everything came to a head. In the end, it was the king's will that triumphed. With a final, crushing blow, he struck down Lord Victor, sending his brother to the cold, unforgiving stone floor. Victor's final breath came with a gurgling sound, his eyes wide in shock, as though he had not fully realized the depths of his failure until the very end. The king stood over him, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in exhaustion. His eyes flickered to Eleanor, who stood quietly by the door, her face a mixture of relief and sorrow. There was no joy in his victory, no celebration, just a deep, gnawing exhaustion that weighed on him as he crossed the room to her side. Father and daughter stood together, surrounded by the remains of their broken world, but there was something else now, something stronger than grief or fear. There was a bond that could never be shattered. And in that silent, solemn moment, as they left the fortress behind, they knew that they had reclaimed not just the kingdom, but each other. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but as they walked away from the darkness, there was a glimmer of light, a promise of a future that, for the first time in what felt like forever, might still be worth fighting for. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.